because it's positive. Okay? Let's do this over Excel in case you guys forgot. It's already up on Canvas site. Let's open that up.
We're gonna do like the equal with the NPV now?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We'll introduce the NPV functions. Yeah, exactly. So you have $100 outflow, it's already at present value, but now you have to find the present value of the future cash inflows. So again, the $10 discounted at 10% over one period or 1 year is worth $9.09. $60 to be received 2 years from now, discounted back 2 years at 10%, is only worth $49.59. The $80 to be received at the end of year 3, discounted 3 years at 10%, it's only worth $60.11. You add up all present values and subtract the initial cash outflow, you get to a net present value of $18.79. Okay? Ignoring franchise S, would you accept franchise L?
Yes,
Why?
because it's the same thing. It's positive.
Right, very good.
What's that thing called? It's called, what's the MPV stand for?
Net present value.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So net present value of L is 18.79. Net present value of S, 19.98. If it's mutually exclusive, which one would you choose?
Yeah.
S.
Yes.
Right. Now, what can change the decision? And I mentioned it before. What can change the decision?
If you have a negative,
No. What can make you choose
Eh,
L instead of S? If something changed here.
Like what?
Something that applies to both. This. Remember I said
Yeah,
the rate
the
matters.
rest matter.
Because that dictates if receiving the money early on is that much more important. Okay? So in this case, franchise S has a higher NPV, so you're gonna choose franchise S. Okay? Now let's do this on Excel. Okay? Okay, so franchise L. I wrote out, the sequence, negative cash outflow, and then the positive inflows. We're using a 10% discount rate. So let's find the net present value. So you do NPV, okay? Then what you're gonna do is you're going to take the rate, which is 10%, okay?
That's the first comment, right?
Yeah, that's where my mouse is hovering over, the cursor,
Gotcha.
10%. Then you're gonna take what that 10% applies to, right? So that applies to year 1, year 2, year 3's cash inflows, right? Because remember, the negative 100 is already at present value, so you're not gonna discount the negative 100. So you're gonna apply that rate, then you're gonna take the cash inflows, and then you're gonna add the negative cash inflow. Does that make sense? So,
When you say add, after you close the parentheses?
exactly, yeah. So, net present value, look at what it says. You're gonna take the rate. The rate is 10%.
Right.
Then you're gonna take the values that you're discounting. You're only discounting it from the 10 to the 80, okay? So you have your present value of your cash inflows. And now on the side, you're gonna subtract the cash outflow.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that's what the formula is doing. So it found the present value of the cash inflows at that rate, and then you're gonna back out the
Minus
the $100. So
That's
that's how
the
you find it.
initial, or that's the initial investment that you put in.
Exactly, yeah. Remember what I said? This is a lot simple, this is very simple, but what if, we'll talk about it later, what if that negative 100 has to be incurred again, say down the road?
Like you did over there. so
Exactly,
you
you
get
have another negative, because usually you find that with investments. Usually like if you own say you build that 2-story building, or whatever it is. You bought the building, it's turnkey, and now you're gonna reap the benefits of cash inflows. But over time, it's not gonna be turnkey anymore, it might need a new roof, so you're gonna have to put out cash to sustain the business. So that's why you'll have a negative cash flow in the outer years as well. And that goes with any investment. Usually you have a fund, right? You're investing in a fund, and it's doing very well. But now the fund is seeking another investment. They're gonna say, okay, we need more money to invest. So you're gonna have to put more money out. So it's very typical of investments to require not just cash at the start, but later on to continue making the money that's been making. Or if a project, you bought a building, and it's an old building, you're hoping that you can turn it around. You buy an old building, you're trying to, improve it. You bought the building, but then over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, you're constantly putting money in to ramp it up and get ready to earn rent revenue.
I'm
So-
laughing because what you're explaining right now is what my building is going through.
Right.
So now they're asking for reserves.
Real estate is very typical of that. So as I said I think I mentioned this class, real estate is a very, very good source of building wealth. It's just not a good source of liquidity.
Right.
Because real estate requires a lot of money. So if you're in the real estate business, where you're reaping the benefits of, the building going up in value, but that you're not paying bills, you're not, that value is unrealized. It's just going up until you sell it. But in order to keep the building running, you have to constantly put money in. A pipe breaks, a roof deteriorates, someone slips and falls and sues your building.
Yep.
All that requires a lot of money. But what you're holding on to is that value of the building going up and up and up, and maybe after 10 to 20 years, that value has tripled in value. And then you sell it and you reap all the benefits of having to pay to sustain it, and then more. So again, but this is very simple. It's cash outflow and then cash inflow. You find the present value of all your cash inflows that are out into the future. You compare that to your initial cash outlay. That's called your net present value. This is the formula, okay? We won't talk about the internal rate of return because that's in the later slides, but let's do it now for franchise S. So franchise S, same thing, okay? It's the same rate, 10%. You have your same initial cash outflow of $100, but the sequence of the money is much more front-loaded. So you're getting $70 at the end of year 1, $50 at the end of year 2, $20 at the end of year 3. You're taking the rate, 10%, you're applying it to that future cash inflows, and then you're backing out the initial cash outflow. And you arrive at your net present value. Your net present value is that $19.98, so we know franchise S is the better deal, right? Any questions? Yeah.
What am I gonna say? I'll probably ask later.
Okay. All right, so that's net present value in a nutshell. The formula I think is rather, simple, but again, use Excel, try to familiarize yourself. On the quiz, you'll be able to, or you'll be required to calculate net present value, so make sure you bring your laptops and have Excel available. We're not gonna learn how to do it in the calculator because that's frankly a waste of time. No one uses the calculator to find present values anymore. It's all done on Excel. It's a lot more simple and a lot more accurate. It's very easy to press the wrong, the wrong button on a calculator. Excel is not gonna calculate it correctly.
Good.
All right, so this is just a walkthrough of how to calculate NPV with Excel, right? So you take your end cash flows. You do not include the cash flow at time 0. Why? Because that's already at present value. So you use the net present value, you take the rate, you apply it over all future cash flows that need to be discounted, and then to that you back out the initial cash outflow, which is already stated as a present value because it's today, right? See, this is a calculator approach. It's very time consuming and very, honestly, it's a recipe for disaster. You have to take out your calculator, you have to type in each cash flow for every respective year, apply a rate, and hoping that your fat thumbs didn't hit the wrong number and get a wrong number. So we're not gonna cover it on Excel.
Gotcha.
On calculator. All right, so in using the NPV measure, which franchise should be accepted? And I made this very important. If franchise S and L are mutually exclusive, you're gonna choose the one with the highest net present value. So you're gonna choose franchise S. If franchise S and franchise L are independent, then you would accept both because they both have a positive NPV, which means they add value to the firm, okay? All right, next thing we're gonna talk about is the internal rate of return, also known as IRR. Jimmy, I would be surprised if you don't run into this. It's very similar to net present value, but what you're doing is you're deriving what rate you're expected to earn on an investment, okay? So the internal rate of return, also known as IRR, is defined as the discount rate that forces the present value of a project's future cash flows to equal the initial cost. So I want you to think about this. So think about it. Internal rate of return is the rate that forces all the present value of the project's future cash flows to equal the initial cost. So when you look at this, okay? When you look at this, let's ignore the 10% for now.
Right.
you know that you're gonna get $10 at the end of year one, you know you're gonna get $60 at the end of year two, and you know you're gonna get $80 at the end of year three. You wanna know what rate would apply to get the present value of these three sequences of cash flows to equal $100. Does that make sense? So, do you think a higher rate is better or worse?
Probably gonna be worse.
Think about the definition. It is the rate that you would need to discount these cash flows by to equal the initial cost, to get a net present value of 0. Think about it. Is a higher rate better or worse? And why?
Don't you want a higher rate?
A higher rate is better. Why is a higher rate better?
Get more return.
Exactly. Higher rate implies that it would take a lot more to discount. Meaning these cash flows are so great that means that the implied rate to get it to equal to the initial cash flow has to be that much greater. So think about it. If your cost of capital is 10%, and in order to get these to equal 100, it takes 30%. That means your rate of return is 30%, right? Conceptually, it's 30%, which is a lot higher than your cost of capital. So think about that. The higher the rate means the higher return you're anticipating from the dollars out in the future. So the higher, the better. You want the highest implied rate of
That's why
return.
I asked you, because
Yeah.
I'm running into that. Because like I was telling you before, I'm at $1.2 million in arrears.
Mhm.
The tenants are not paying their rent, right? So I'm trying to compare this so I can understand it better. When my executive officer is talking, it's like he trying to pull one on me on my building, but he's asking for $1 million in reserves to fix the building. I'm like, wait a minute, what the professor said. I'm talking in my head when he's talking.
Yeah, so again, we're going back to internal rate of return. So again, the internal rate of return is defined that basically what rate forces all your future cash flows to equal the initial cost. So in other words, the internal rate of return is equal to the discount rate that forces the net present value to equal 0, which means that the IRR is an estimate of the project's expected rate of return. Does that make sense? It is the implicit rate of return that a project is anticipated to make. All right? So what's the rationale for using the internal rate of return method? Think about bond's yield, right? If a bond's yield is greater than the risk-adjusted after-tax cost of capital, then buying the bond adds value to the firm. So by that same logic, if a project's internal rate of return is greater than the appropriate risk-adjusted after-tax cost of capital, that means that project adds value to the firm, right? So what I said here, in this sequence of cash flows, we know that the rate of return is higher than 10%, right? How do we know it's higher than 10%? How do we know the rate of return on these cash flows is greater than 10%?
Because we know that it's gonna change as
Per year.
per period.
I
Because
hear you.
we're counting,
Cause that 10%.
At 10%, you already had a net present value remaining. So you know you can afford to discount it even more,
Right.
which means that the rate of return that these cash flows have is greater than the cost of capital. Does that make sense? So the internal rate of return tells you it's greater than the cost of capital because you have a positive net present value,
Right.
right? Okay. So in talking about internal rates of return, again, that's an estimate of a project's expected rate of return. Just remember that. Okay? So, if a project's internal rate of return is greater than the cost of capital, then that means implementing the project adds value to the company, right? If IRR is less than the cost of capital, the company would suffer a loss in value. Okay? So this is the equation. You don't need to memorize it to determine the internal rate of return. We're going to use Excel, of course. So again, the IRR is the rate that makes this equation true. It's the rate that takes all your future cash flows and basically makes it equal to the initial cash outflow to arrive at a net present value of 0. Okay? So let's look at this. So this should look very similar, okay? You have your initial cash outflow, right?
Mhm.
Then you have your cash inflows in the outer years. You're gonna find the present value of all of them,
Mhm.
and you're gonna figure out what rate gets the sum of those present values of future cash inflows to equal the cash outflow, meaning net present value is 0. Okay? So what rate of return gets you to a net present value of 0? What would it take for all these future cash inflows to be discounted to equal the initial cash outflow so you can have a net present value of 0? Okay, so that's your internal rate of return. So let's start working on that. So again, we're gonna do it on Excel. So let's see if there's this is slide 22. Yeah. All right. So let's focus on franchise L. This was a sequence of cash flows for franchise L. We had a negative 100 going out now. Then we have 10 coming in year 1, 60 at the end of year 2, and 3 at the end of year, 80 at the end of year 3, right? So this is our formula. We're gonna
add all of them together.
No, it's not adding. You're using the internal rate of return formula. Okay? Remember, you're deriving the rate, so you're not going to be using a cost of capital. You're
Right.
deriving the rate that equates all the future cash flows to equal your initial cash outflow. So all you're doing is you're taking IRR
Mhm.
and you're going to take the full sequence of cash flows, and remember, it's in order, right? You're not skipping columns, so it knows this is year 1, this is year 2, this is year 3, this is year 4. You cannot skip columns, because if you skip a column, what is it telling Excel? It's telling Excel that, say you inserted a column,
Right.
then it's gonna tell Excel that the $80 is not received at the end of year 3, but at the end of year 4. So you have to make sure your sequence is aligned. You have the negative 100 year 1, and now, 10 at the end of year 1, 60 at the end of year 2, and 80 at the end of year 3. If you fuck it up and start inserting columns, then it's gonna confuse Excel and it's gonna think that you are having $80 come in at the end of year 4, not the end of year 3. Okay? You have to have very organized, Excel is all about being organized and knowing what the hell you're doing, because if you start messing it up, it's gonna, if you see, you need to make sure you have it. So that's internal rate of return. You use the IRR function and you grab all values, right? And it derives what discount rate you need to apply to get a net present value of 0. So this means that you would have to discount these 3 cash flows by 18.13% in order to get a net present value of 0. So that, what is that telling you? It's telling you that this is projecting an internal rate of return or an expected rate of return of 18%. If you borrow at 10%, isn't that a great, arbitrage? You're making 18 and borrowing 10%. So the IRR is greater than the cost of capital, so you know it's going to add value to the firm. Okay? Now let's do it for franchise S. Different sequence, right? But we're going to use the same formula. We do IRR, and we're going to grab all the values. Okay? So it grabs all the values, and it computes a rate of return equal to 23.56. Remember what we said? Franchise S had a higher net present value than franchise L. Remember? Mm-hmm. So you can expect the internal rate of return to be higher for franchise S. Okay? So we're not doing it in the calculator, only on Excel. Okay. So again, just in other words, the internal rate of return is the discount rate that forces the present value of a project's expected future cash flows to equal the initial cash flow, which is negative, right? All right. All right, so now let's talk about finding the internal rate of return for constant cash flows. We weren't dealing with constant before, right? We were talking about the irregular cash flows, right? So when we talk about franchise L and franchise S, Jimmy, these weren't constant, right? We had 10, 60, 80,
Right.
70, 50, 20. Now what if they're constant, right? So if they're constant,
The same number over and over, right?
yeah, exactly, it's 40, 40, 40. Remember when we did with bonds? We only had to use the rate function. We didn't have to do a internal rate of return, because the rate function assumes an equal sequence of cash flow. So in this case, you have a negative 100, and then you have 40 after year 1, 40 after year 2, and 40 after year 3. They're constant, okay? So your formula, you're gonna do a rate formula like how we did before. Remember that, Jimmy?
Yep, the equal sign, rate.
Yeah. So this is, what slide is this? Slide 24. Did I do this one? I believe I did. Maybe not. All right. I guess I didn't do slide 24. Oh, I did. I just have the wrong number. All right. All right. So this is the calculator way, and then we'll do it how we've done it before. So franchise S, we have cash outflow of 100, and we have 70, 50, 20, right? But again, that's not the important thing. We're talking about if the sequence had a constant payment of $40, right? So again, in this sequence, we're getting $40 at the end of year 1, $40 at the end of year 2, and $40 at the end of year 3. If we want to derive the internal rate of return, we can simply use the rate function because it's constant. So if we go to the formula, we do equals rate and fill in the parameters. Number of periods, 3, right? What's the payment? $40, it's a constant cash flow. What's the present value? It's your initial outflow, $100. There's no future value. Fill in those parameters, you derive your internal rate of return, and it's 9.7. So you didn't have to do the internal rate of, you didn't have to do the IRR formula because again, it's a constant sequence of cash flow. So if it's a constant sequence, you just need to use the rate function, okay? So let's make decisions now based off IRR. Let's ignore what we know from the NPV. We're only making decisions now on IRR. You should arrive to the same conclusion, right? So if franchise S and franchise L are independent, then you would accept both if their internal rates of return are higher than the cost of capital, okay? If franchise S and L are mutually exclusive and you can only pick one, you would accept S because S has a higher internal rate of return than franchise L. So you arrive at the same conclusions as the net present value, right? If you could select both, you would choose both because they both have a positive net present value. In other words, they both have an internal rate of return that's greater than the cost of capital. If it's mutually exclusive, meaning you can only choose one, same with net present value. You would accept S as having the higher net present value, or you would choose S because it has a higher internal rate of return. You'll get to the same conclusion with internal rate of return as you would with net present value. It's just a different method of doing it. IRR is not dependent on the cost of capital. It's just comparing the two, okay? So what are the two methods we use so far to analyze projects?
The IRR,
Right? And what's the other one?
the net
Present value. Very good. Net present value. Okay? Alright. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back, and then we'll start talking more about NPV profiles and the other metrics.